Anyone feel like 2021 wasn't much of a step up from the last year? I mean, the beginning of the end of the apocalypse is probably less painful than the start by default, but this year doesn't seem like the dove it should have been. It just seems less chaotic, but it's still a pretty boring dystopia. Not even fictional cartoon dogs can truly escape the current hellscape. It's not like I don't want to make feature length videos about cartoons, but this year has just been straight sabotage from start to finish. Literally every month is a new flavor of terrible. Everything changes, the ennui and disillusionment still stays the same. Literally everything you know about me has changed. For one, I live in the woods now. It gets darker sooner, it gets colder faster, I'm landlocked by horse farms, and it's basically a complete 180 from everything I've known and cared about. If you no longer have the ability to order shitty 7-Eleven tacos at 11:23 at night, what is even the point of being here? I'm stuck on Wawanakwa without an escape plan. Even with Wi-Fi enabled, access can be kind of precarious, with the most inclement weather being able to hijack any connection to the outside world. Network TV has kind of been a wash lately, so the most accessible option is probably not the one you're given the most headspace at this current moment. PBS actually has like 4 or 5 channels up that you can tap into at any time of day, but since I'm used to having cartoons on as background noise, I decided to throw on a little PBS Kids. After News Hour, it just seems like the perfect type of shit to take the edge off, you know? So over the course of weeks, I have been thoroughly sucked into the current lineup. I have loved, I have lost, I have listlessly coasted through movie night. I've seen it all. Enough of these shows were interesting enough that I subconsciously started writing down my thoughts, and along the way, it turned into this 2-hour behemoth. Now, obviously, rankings, tier lists, charts, they destroy the discourse, they're bad for me, they're bad for anime, yada yada yada. Alright, that's still a little bit accurate. But somewhere along the way, this tier list plopped into my lap. It's been discussed quite a lot. There's no one take that anyone can agree on except for the fact that had this list been in their control, it would have been vastly different. And I would happen to agree with that. The OP was kind enough to throw me the template, and I looked at it casually just to see which shows that I would watch after this was all said and done. Though the more time had passed, the more I had actually wanted to initiate the tier list reformation and come up with my own that seemed a bit more balanced, a little more equitable. So that's exactly what I decided to do. Here's how we're going to do this. 12 hours, 22 series. Over the course of half a day, I laid out every single show that airs in every time slot from dawn till dusk. It covers the whole stretch of the brand, new and old. Whatever's airing right now, at least where I am, it gets a mention. This is a very methodical process. I'm only dropping timestamps for a few items, so pay attention. For one, I will leave one that will split this 12-hour day in half because I am not a complete monster. There's a few shows that I would personally recommend, and they will only be identified by their timestamp because the titles are not going to be the biggest draw. I'm just being real here. And before I get drawn and quartered, I will also drop the timestamps for the 2 shows in the thumbnail so you can actually get a sense of what my take is. You might have noticed that one of them was actually recommended too. Comes at the very end. Probably save the best for last, but you gotta get through all the bullshit before you get to it. The sooner we get through the current schedule, the sooner we get to rank them all. Again, I didn't think I would ever structure another video like this, but the reaction to that tier list probably bothered me more than the actual list itself. PBS Kids doesn't exactly have stuff that you could watch into adulthood as easily as stuff on Cartoon Network or Disney. We know that they tend to set a gold standard, but most can only judge based on the few scant years they may have spent with PBS Kids themselves. Some would say Superwise, the cream of the crop. Others would nominate Curious George, and many other, like a disturbing amount of people, would put Sagwa on top. I think it's more likely people would be receptive to watching some of these newer ones, even if they were made for kids younger than we were way back when. But of course they don't have a proper reference point for these things, So their tunnel vision is zeroing in on the same few shows instead of what kids today would actually be watching. Consider this the reference guide. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to find some common ground between the new and the old. You'll likely disagree with some of my choices too, not gonna lie, it's just a tier list. But if this 2-hour video can convince somebody to give one of the new greats a shot, then my work has already been done. Sit back, relax, get ready to take some notes. I'm quizzing you on Monday. We're gonna do it big.
Funding for this adventure is brought to you in part by...
This is a pretty interesting show to land on first because, while generally being a decently executed concept, it is by and large a victim of its own success. Spanning about 3 seasons over the course of 8 years, The Cat in the Hat knows a lot about that, has lived to see various ideas and concepts outrank it while it's still airing. By design, it's supposed to be evocative of other scientific or discovery-based shows like Curious George or Sid the Science Kid. It's not bad by any stretch, but it does seem a bit bland compared to everything else. It's engaging, it's well designed, it keeps the spirit of the character in mind, even if it has to soften the cat a little bit. It is easily one of the least controversial Seussian projects to date, but it's being outshone by its contemporaries all throughout its run. And that's a shame, because it does have something to it.
This episode was made possible by the following.
Hi, I'm Johnny Quasar, and this is my robot dog, Goddard. Bark, 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 bark.
I have a sinking suspicion I will likely end up on somebody's shit list for not giving this one the instant 11 out of 10 it's been hyped up to be. But honestly, it hasn't got as much to it. It's easier to view this separately from the last 2.5 shows in the Craig Bartlett cinematic universe. That's because by and large, this has very little tangible connection to them outside of some philosophical concepts they reinforce. I don't want to sell that as a net negative on its face. There are plenty of creatives that make entirely separate concepts with very little aim to revisit them without due reason. In the context of animation, it probably is easiest to invoke the likes of Genndy Tartakovsky. His body of work is a roller coaster. Each of the projects carries a different mood and aesthetic. From Dexter's Lab to Samurai Jack to the Hotel Transylvania works, you could even consider the Popeye movie that's in and out of development as part of this track. Each one of them is a very different beast, and you can still draw its main inspiration back to him, or one of his primary inspirations. Even the latter, which was only at the behest of his direction, of course, still managed to ooze like pure Genndy in design philosophy. It can help as much as it can hinder a creative work. No doubt many were turned off initially from the likes of American Dad because of its nebulous connection to Seth MacFarlane. I think quite a few people can give Hamster and Gretel the side-eye after witnessing the saga of Milo Murphy's Law trying to escape the platypus-sized shadow that eclipses it. Here, while this show doesn't crib any special attributes carried over from its creator, it doesn't present much on its own either. I won't deny the main premise itself would probably be pretty interesting in theory. The theme song sells itself pretty well, like any of the others. Ready, Jet, Go is pretty reliant on character interaction. You have to get into the banter and the energy of the dialogue to be invested in it. It's a space alien-based sitcom with extra steps. Easily, the most engaging of them is probably the main character, Jet, who has a frenetic but naive sense of the Earth and voraciously consumes as much culture as possible. All the aliens have a bouncier set of movement, which I thought was a nice touch. The broader focus on STEM concepts does give them a degree of flexibility in what they want to cover. We can get a lot of stuff done, even when our protagonists are stationary. I gave this one a bit more attention to try to get to the root of its appeal. At best, it does its job, but generally I wonder how effective it was at making everything stick. Part of why the show has the following it does is because of those 2 or 3 side characters that are broad enough to be proxies for the audience. They still contribute to the show, and arguably without them, this show would not be the same. That being said, the focus they get outside of the show is still kind of excessive. You can't just reverse engineer memes like this. The energy that these folks bring when they engage with the show is real, it's palpable. I can feel it in my bones. But otherwise, it's just an aggressively mid product. Nothing too bad, nothing too good about it either.
Egg plus cat is made possible in part by
Parentheses first, exponents next. Multiplication and division in the same step. Addition and subtraction, if you got the nerve. From left to right, first come, first serve.
Peg plus Cat is a program of a certain pedigree that not only managed to tackle an underrepresented niche in an engaging fashion, but it also gave the world another generally absurdist and fun comedy to indulge in. Kickstarted by a duo most prolifically associated with ancient Nick Jr. fare, the series was plucked from a group of pitches for a new math show in the ancient year of 2010. The titular characters cavort around this universe, making friends and figuring stuff out. Despite its formulaic structure and somewhat crude appearance, the show is much smarter, faster, and kinder than one may initially give it credit for, which results in a really unique experience. Peg plus Cat operates at a breakneck pace. Paired with the slightly sloppy notebook aesthetic they're going for, it gives the impression that these adventures are really just the slapdash comic escapades of some random kid working through math lessons. Between its structure and pacing, it has a good energy about it. The songs are pretty solid. I believe the approach to songwriting may have actually been replicated in an unexpected reboot we'll touch upon later. But once you see it, it's hard to shake that perception. Fundamentally, I'm still blown away by how under the radar this one is. To me, it does well to defy and exceed expectations. It's a really fun and energetic concept, but also palatable and understandable on surface level. Moreover, it's not beholden to the work of the old masters. This is a new cyber chase just because it's covering math. It's wholly its own original thing, and even as a bit more sentimental, it has a great edge. Paired with its comedic timing, the tone of the show is exactly what was needed at the time. It's an innovator of its outfit for sure.
Superwhy is funded by...
Tell me why? Tell me super why.
Superwhy is the type of show we let slip by so casually, yet would be the perfect type of bait for nostalgic pseudo-analysis. A show about the self-insert child of fucking Jack and the Beanstalk going around with other self-insert type reinterpretations of literature to literally rewrite books and solve their own day-to-day issues. How insane is that? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how insane? Drew Gooden could easily ramble his way through a 30-minute video about it and drop way more hot bars than he did in that fucking Scooby-Doo video, but neither he nor anybody else had the stones to even make the attempt. Shameful. Apparently this show had 3 seasons, of which the first seems to be pretty much all PBS tends to air. Its syndication length, with the second one being much, much smaller. The third, and continually smaller season was done by a new studio because the old one had shut down, and it looks horrendous in comparison. I can't excoriate the new guys. The show already looked dated as hell. It was probably a Herculean task to even attempt to replicate it. The rest of the show was pretty flawless by comparison, not gonna brag. Part of what made this video concept so interesting was not just watching and analyzing how each of these shows work, but also how other people respond to them. Shows and concepts you otherwise would see as dopey or a tad ineffective get a lot of love and praise when Black Twitter gets involved. A lot of genuine affection for these unsuspecting bastions of nostalgia. So initially I was ready to swoop past this one and move on to more interesting fare, but the extra attention it got pushed me to look at it a bit longer. As it turns out, Superwhy becomes like one of those magic paintings. If you're outside the target audience, you don't really get it until you squint at it long enough. What I saw after maybe a month on and off observing it was that it's a show that went pretty hard in the paint for its curriculum, and while pretty measured and looking definitely dated, even for its time, it did its job very well. It stands out much more than others because that pure effort is the most identifiable part of the show. Its songs are pretty much comparable to any other show in its lineup, but it doesn't take away from them being really, really good. By many accounts, it's still a very unique and engaging premise as far as PBS Kids content goes, and though others may retread the same subject matter, they have not replicated its level of engagement. Not bad for a 13-year-old property.
Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood is made possible in part by...
You know what I got for Christmas? It was a banner freaking year at the Tiger House. I got a carton of cigarettes. Old man grabbed me, said, "Hey, smoke up, Tony." There, great!
Alright, so Daniel Tiger is simultaneously a very easy and yet very difficult series to comprehend. I think the weight of the work put into it far outweighs any basic dismissal of its outcomes, but it's still tough to quantify what this show is or what it means. Unironically, some high IQ shit, I gotta tell you. Out of the gate, we know it's a reinterpretation of the Fred Rogers cinematic universe, and it's a continuation that ages all the established neighborhood characters up and gives most of them children that learn lessons from the presumed old-school make-believe backdrop. It's built off the familiar social-emotional framework and cribs a lot of the same aesthetic to get its point across. It's soft and slow and a bit out of place, but it has grown into this bastion, this heap of a franchise, and what's essentially a flagship series for PBS. Part of what makes it so hard to examine is its highly polarizing reception. The Daniel Tiger is today what Barney was yesterday. Anyone set to speak on it can either love it or hate it, both for compelling reasons. Obviously, this show was left to shoulder the burden of carrying Fred's legacy forward a good decade after he passed. The show is aimed at really small kids, so the whole feel of make-believe was softened up. In ways, it tries to keep the older elements at arm's length from the rest of the show. Neighborhood historians have little to find here, and the same could be said for people who grew up with the original project. There's a lot of mimicry in old tunes and concepts. The show itself tries to become a giant Easter egg for the parents that grew up with it. The show itself was built off a lot of delicate reconstructions of these characters, but it's all too common for adults to reject it outright. I know several that absolutely loathe this product and, in their view, everything that it stands for. Parents are no exception to this rule. Plenty see the good in it and decide to take the hit to watch it with their kids. Others are wishy-washy on the show itself, and others claim it makes their kids into little monsters. The full spectrum of opinions is there, but it feels rare that the good in the show is earnestly acknowledged. For one, it's a very straightforward teaching tool. In many ways, it would go about getting its point across much in the same vein its progenitor would. All the little ditties they come up with seem like songs that he would come up with on the fly. Its clear structure and repetitious nature is easy for the target audience to latch onto. One of the co-creators of Blue's Clues and The Last Entry was in charge of bringing this concept to life, and the influence is very tangible. Moreover, there's a growing glut of anecdotal and researched evidence that would suggest Daniel does well with many children, most especially those on the autism spectrum. Even if it's hard to digest, it's clear that there's some tangible good there. PBS is also aware of Daniel Tiger's power. It's one of the most highly praised, widely seen, vastly merchandised franchises that they've ever had. It's considered Paw Patrol with ethics. Tough to swallow, but mandatory fun for your kid and their new best friend. It's tough to imagine a current PBS Kids without it. It would have been even harder to imagine it with him 10 years back. A concerted effort to pivot to series that can reach a younger viewer base after the PBS Kids Go experiment led to projects like these paying off in spades. Its most prolific and tangible connection to its past legacy and how it looks to benefit the populace even today. Its breakout success enabled its production house to produce even more shows for PBS of varying subjects. Nearly 10 years after its premiere, it's still high and kicking with additional season orders, and it's seemingly more untouchable than ever. I know I'm not here to recap the whole show's existence, but the extra context does help you understand it a bit more. Stuff like that occupied my brain folds while I attempted to consume this content that's long past attaining my full and rapt attention. The main thing I could understand was how ubiquitous Daniel Tiger is. Many affiliates stuff their schedules full of reruns, in addition to the heavily valued premieres and specials. I'm guessing sometime recently they launched this series of shorts that aired in between programs, showing off what the characters may do in their spare time. The show was on when I usually woke up and when I went to bed. It was there in between shows, and it was plugged in many, many commercials. He is literally inescapable. It's this transparent popularity that may color one's perception of the show itself. When I watch Daniel Tiger, it feels like light homework. I'm not necessarily tuned out, but nearly every episode is seemingly a social exercise, so you're left waiting for the beats and measures when you know that the main theme is going to come into play. There are a lot of kids that are a lot like Daniel himself, but he obviously has to deal with a little bit more. It does feel like most of his escapades are built to trigger an emotional response. He's supposedly a low-key character like his dad, but he's human enough to experience anger, sadness, and fear. Except, he experiences those things all the time. The very first episode is built around being flexible, right? It's his birthday, and the celebration doesn't go exactly as planned. He gets to decorate a cake. He gets a tiger cake, and he's super into it. Only for him to get home, and the cake is all smashed up. Now, obviously, cake is cake, right? You know, you're not going to waste it. The whole point of that was to teach a child to be flexible with bad circumstances. But it's weird to witness things like that over and over and over and over again. Each time, every time, it is necessary for him to model these experiences as they're things that his viewers would likely go through as well. There are very few episodes that feel like they're just built to be organic retellings of his day. Everything was set up from the get-go to preach what's being taught. The show effortlessly breezes through topics and concepts that we considered revolutionary 10 or 20 years ago. In exchange, these characters feel flatter than Flat Stanley when they're modeling these concepts. Daniel is merely just a tool for the audience, not a fully realized entity. Hate the game, not the player. If anything, you should probably be feeling sorry for him, which is not exactly conducive to an enjoyable viewing experience. I harbor no hate for this show, but I do wonder how it would be if its teaching style wasn't as didactic and measured. It could very well have been the next Sesame Street, but much of its obvious good is washed away in a sea of vitriol because it's a little too soft. It's a fascinating dichotomy of thought. In general, I'd struggle to imagine someone I would recommend this to because it's far from irredeemable garbage, but there's very few people out of that slim target margin that can probably partake in its whims without much dissent. I get it, I'm not 6 feet deep into the show either, but the reaction it arouses in exchange for what the content seems to be is kind of excessive. It's a very specific type of show, and I hope its good continues to translate into real impact. I also hope PBS collects as much Daniel Tiger money as they can get their hands on before this big fat star implodes in on itself. If not for obvious survival, but so this very polarizing show may help others inspire kids the same way it has. That's all that one can really ask for at the end of the day.
Sesame Street has been brought to you today by the letter D and by the number 2.
So, fair warning, this will be one of several long runners in this lineup that I'm forced to give a much more critical pat down. The legacies and collective good that these series have are not to be scoffed at, but there are important details and later developments that are important to discuss, especially in the context of highlighting the most current PBS Kids experience. What better place to start than at this location? Sesame Street is beyond mere explanation. It's an experience innate to the advent of recent Americana, but it's also meant to speak to the human experience and reinforce the tenets of public service. Most of you know the story already. The right amount of people from all walks of life came together to make this wild show to get some little kids ready for school. It revolutionized the whole existence of children's educational content, for without the street, the intersectional landscape of entertainment itself would be much more bleak, much less vast, and definitely not as profitable. It set the unobtainable standard for basically everything else in this lineup. Without it, there might not even be a PBS Kids. Though its legacy is long storied and well respected by today's standards, it has not always been sunny days in this domain. historically different entities in the US and abroad have tried to impede the show from making itself known, whether due to the social landscape at the time or due to the culture shock of different educational standards. A lot has changed since then, and the standards for what is just have shifted quite dramatically, but in many ways Sesame Street as an institution has still been in for the fight of its life. Its contributions to the field of public television have done as much to assist its progress as it has to politicize it. PBS is usually co-opted by right-leaning politicians in every single conversation about wasteful spending. Its comparatively meager $450 million budget given from the federal government has been used to cast aspersions on the content and how it's been used for decades. More generally, the funds PBS can funnel into content is limited, and as you may see later in this video, the ramifications of less fruitful funding cycles can really shake a show out of whack. Its popularity has served it well, but since early into its run, Sesame Street has been working extensively to fund their own mission. Through many ups and downs, the story took an unexpected turn a few years back when its first-run distribution rights were claimed by none other than HBO, which later became acquired by Time Warner AT&T's Super Titan that came to be. So basically, Sesame Street is morally obligated to appear in PBS, but more so, its bigger, newer glut of episodes were put behind a 9-month embargo before reaching PBS member stations. The financial stability granted was exchanged for a bit of an entitlement. Those disadvantaged demographics Sesame Street aimed to help were being considered second due to the extenuating circumstances. Some of this tension may be relieved through the HBO Max deal and the possible accessibility it may bring. Otherwise, the deal was looked at quite unfavorably, despite the net good that it probably did. It's evident that the show itself fjords against a rapid current of swiftly changing worlds. They valiantly run to catch up, but they're not always leading the pack in modern times. Even their more successful initiatives can become marred with scandal and controversy. Its autism awareness campaign was in development for nearly a decade and was largely scrutinized for one entity's involvement. Just one. Autism Speaks. While seemingly drawing from a more equal spread of contributors, collaborators, and advisors early on, by 2019, much of the material distributed by Sesame Workshop came under fire and intense scrutiny for the aforementioned organization speaking for autistic people in counterproductive and inappropriate ways. Eventually, its other consultants saw fit to leave the partnership as a result of the workshop allegedly ignoring their criticisms and turning away from their ideas. Now, there's plenty of smaller, scattered controversies that could be addressed. These are the most relevant to understanding the scope of the show in today's climate. There are other concepts and characters that, while ultimately well-meaning, were capped for the good of the audience. Their highest aim is to keep up with current educational standards. The new millennium ushered in a lighter, softer, and more gentrified street in the name of bettering the standards. In recent years, they even killed off the age-old magazine format in favor of a more conventional half-hour block focused on one topic. Now, as someone who grew up within the Elmo Attitude era, the changes made forthright seem pretty rapid, to say the least. I don't have much to say on the program itself. There are numerous justifications employed to defend or disseminate modern Sesame Street by people more educated than me in Muppet politics. I guess this is a rather useless opinion in the context of this video, but personally, I'd rather adopt a more diplomatic opinion. If it's good for the kids, that's all that kind of matters. There's a generous degree of subjectivity in determining how much the program tilts in one direction or the other. They have the whole series up on HBO Max. I think that satisfies any nostalgic brainworms that occasionally crop up. I don't hold any issues with the current format against the show. There's a lot of complicated moves and circumstances that justified it, as there always is. But my MO in bringing all this up was to give you a better peek behind the curtain, a more updated look at what Sesame Street currently is and what it deals with. My hope is that in another 10 or 20 years, when they regroup to evaluate and overhaul the data, they may continue to be critical of past mistakes and move forward with a better tack. That 100th anniversary special better be worth the wait.
I Eleanor Wonders Why is made possible in part by...
As a concept, Eleanor Wonders Why is pretty simplistic, which is perhaps its greatest strength. Describing the appeal of it, or everything they got right, is a bit tricky. This feels less like an overview and more like a pitch. Really, the show sells itself, but I don't know anyone who enjoys the show that wouldn't try to preach the gospel all the same. And I'm part of that niche. Next to Bluey, this show features the patron saint of wholesome vibes. It clears the pores, it waters the crops, it gives you that double whammy of feels every single time. It does everything. That's no exaggeration. Despite being some of the most wholesome content, these two shows have a powerful hold on some sects of 4chan itself. For parents, it's considered a respite from the deluge of empty, mostly mindless chatter their kids normally watch, replacing it with something a bit more quiet, subtle, and real. For everyone else, it's just cute shit with some style. I mean, come on now. The main thing about it is it doesn't exactly run parallel to Bluey as far as appeal goes. They offer distinctly different experiences, and it's easy to tell how this one wins the crowd over. The main character is easily the pitch hitter. Eleanor is certainly more conventionally cute than your Arthurs and Franklins, but the adventures she embarks on still follow in step as down-to-earth romps. Characters like this usually walk a fine line between relatable and irritating. Sometimes they can deftly feature both and make a different experience altogether. On paper, her angle would be difficult to quantify, and I feel her earnest nature and avid curiosity does help to cement her squarely in the cute camp. Though some may take umbrage with her voice, just fair warning.
That is so interesting!
Like everything in this space is very openly relaxed, but it doesn't feel too forced. On the technical side, the show looks great. Its naturalistic setting was peppered with a lot of little touches that help bring the aesthetic together. The animation itself seems like a well-oiled machine. The character rigging seems a bit more complicated, accommodating for certain angles whilst moving at a slightly slower pace. The background design is probably a highlight. It's not overly detailed or super eye-catching, but considering how much the show relies on looking to nature, it does well setting the aesthetic on fire. Personally, I love when the main trio break out of frame and they transition from scene to scene in those little ink blot splatters. It just gives everything a storybook aesthetic. This show is your standard scientifically inclined discovery-based show about kids just exploring things and figuring stuff out. It's pretty much the most popular template, which is why PBS Kids has 6 billion of these premises in the back pocket. Couldn't give points for originality, but be honest, that's not why we're here, right? Unlike the rest of the animation fandom that is looking to promote the most original new content by slapping 16 arbitrary labels on them, this show is unpretentious in its mission to explore the outdoors. Part of why it's probably well respected is likely because it harkens back to cartoons of old. It managed to stand out despite its world-weary premise. It's more or less the gold standard of the canon, and encapsulates the ethos of what people look for in these shows.
Clifford the Big Red Dog is made possible in part by...
Here comes Clifford, everyone loves Clifford, exploring the world from A to Z. Here comes Clifford, you can count on Clifford, the biggest, reddest dog in history.
Alright, so I'm assuming at this point in time I will have already gone into pretty extensive detail in this other video about all the Clifford cartoons, so I will keep it brief here. While cutting as much bias out of my assessment, this just seems like a subpar reboot of the 2000s show. It works off a good template for something new, but it shares a lot in common with Powerpuff Girls 2016. Damn, that is a crazy sentence to be saying. It borrows too much from the original without putting enough substantial roughage in that is wholly its own. As a viewer, it's probably like having to transition from House of Mouse to Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. It's definitely trying, and they make some interesting creative choices, but it's generally coming at the detriment of what's known as a pretty lovable franchise. Especially for something that's being sold as a third season of sorts.
This episode was made possible by the following.
There was a time where Dinosaur Train was the hottest thing on the block, the most devious lick, and kids' entertainment was the millions, sometimes billions of dollars one entity can life steal. When you think of PBS, you probably think of more modest circumstances, but Dinosaur Train was no different from Paw Patrol in this regard, let me tell you. I mean, this was prime entertainment value, just combining shit that kids like and then making all the toys. Give me a Ninja Pirates pitch next. It'll make millions. As far as entertainment value goes, it was pretty serviceable. The main premise gave enough freedom for the show to talk about any dinosaur or ancient animals they chose. It's not the most useful scientific subject, but, you know, they can't all be Bill Nye. You gotta have a little levity. Rewatching it felt so foreign to me. It seems like there's some continuity at play, and the vibe just seems a bit more settled later on. It's not exactly Hey Arnold now, but it's certainly different. It had 10 years to get into it, though. It actually finished airing the last season early into the current crisis. Whether they get another order, it's pretty nebulous. All the same, it's an untouchable spot for them, whether it's officially over or not. There's a reason why most of what I had to say about it was about everything except the show itself.
Let's Go Luna is made possible in part by
It's a dream that's coming true when the moon says, I love you.
Let's Go Luna has a world's worth of appeal packed in its modest episode order. It took me a while to catch everything it has to offer, but after getting the full scope of its abilities, I'm confident it's a certifiable slam dunk. Though its most notable attribute is undoubtedly the showrunner behind it, the show is able to deftly defy being pigeonholed by past or present influence and offer a whole new experience. What I'm saying is that it does everything Ready, Jet, Go shit. The baser idea of the show apparently originated from this book Joe Murray penned ages ago about a little boy inviting a ravenously lonely moon over for dinner. The concept itself was workshopped into a more general premise of exploring the world with the moon never too far behind. The way the show explains it is tops, but beyond that, the dynamic established between the kids and Luna is a dominant force within the context of the story. It's kinda cool that the moon can just pop out of the sky and freely roam the Earth when she's not on the clock. It seems like the show is a bit slower in pacing than the others, but it doesn't lose its edge in a way. I appreciate that it can feel a bit more nurturing and sentimental without being saccharine or sappy. I also appreciate that the art style made a concerted effort to be in keeping with Murray's typical work. Not even the best of them can incorporate that subtle character acting in there, so it's nice to see it used here from time to time. Even when clearly puppet rigged, it keeps things moving. It even incorporates the occasional visual gag you more likely would see in Laszlo or Rocco. Moreover, I like that it can truly be its own thing. Even as a young kid's property about exploring diverse cultures, it still manages to harken back to its predecessors without sacrificing its own creative goals. It maintains the right vibe for a show of its ilk. It doesn't backhand you with culture or anything. The last show that took up this subject is likely super old, and while more naturalistic in theory, it ain't got shit on this one. It's a bit more of a slow burn type of show, even in episodic chunks, but I'm sure that many can get into the swing of this one. Every half hour is spent in the same location over 2 segments. It leaves a lot to be taken in, whether in the culture being explored or the characters we learn about along the way. It's such a rich idea tackling a wide subject with a really intriguing premise. It's everything the best are made to be.
This program was made possible by...
You know what? Bring out the monkey! Bring out the monkey! No! No, turn off his music! Turn off it! Do not applaud him! What the f*** is wrong with you?
S tier on site, no explanation needed. 10,000 out of 10 Chad tier programming. Moving on.
Funding for Nature Cat is provided by the...
A cat credit card!
No respect at all.
For as long as I've known about Nature Cat, it's always made a positive impression on me. Before Eleanor came on the block, this was the dominant natural science property on the PBS Kids lineup. Handcrafted out of a desire to get kids exploring the outdoors, it was established by some of the most prolific people in modern puppetry. Several SNL cast members make up a prominent clump of the show's characters, including the title character himself. Many other creative elements came together to create a very energetic, informative space for kids to learn about nature. What initially kept my attention was the frenetic animation. It's a lot more lively than many other shows of the current lineup, let alone back when it premiered. The art style kind of makes it seem like the characters were drafted as puppets at first. It's definitely louder and more excitable than others, but it has a good energy about it. If there were any set of characters that were made to emphasize a child entry point, it's these four. I read an analysis somewhere that each character symbolizes a type of kid that'd be tepidly interested in exploring nature, but is stuck watching this show instead. Despite being animals of different backgrounds, their collective knowledge of natural science is kinda lacking, but it's the enthusiasm that keeps the show's momentum in step. Unexpectedly, Nature Cat has become notable for its songwriting proficiency. Spawning a whole album based on its melodies, its cast has managed to stay in tune while their characters step up to the plate to protect their surroundings. I will give this show props for giving Kate Micucci songs that actually complement her voice. Way back when, the show would typically air back-to-back with Steven Universe reruns, and the schism between the way these two approach it is so jarring. It's fascinating, even. It's definitely not for everyone, but I think Nature Cat's different approach is what makes it so appealing. If I had to compare it to anything, I'd see a lot of fetch with Rough Men and its trappings. Twofold, it's not only a pretty popular offering, but it's always been doggedly determined to educate its base, even if they had to shout it from the rooftops.
Wild Kratts is made possible by
me and you and Zaboomafoo. Come along and see what's new. We're doing the things that animals do.
Now this show is near parallel to The Wrath of Dinosaur Train. They're both long-running animal series that practically print money due to the premise and the creatives behind it. I'd argue that it got more into the characters and the mythos of Wild Kratts more so, but I'd be fucked to remember any important villains or plot points. All I know is that the Kratt brothers get to use these animal omnitrixes to affect the course of their story and that of the random animal of the day. It's structured like a New Age Captain Planet, I guess. Like, even within the safer boundaries of PBS, you can consider our protagonists in palpable danger at times. Though even with a more action-packed premise than the likes of Zaboomafoo, the brothers squeeze as much animal know-how into each and every episode. They always have a cold open in the place where they feature animal lives for extra detail. I think this has become less of a pronounced feature in current year, but I've always appreciated the high quality of the animation itself. Word has it that the Kratts established a studio in Ontario to handcraft it. Its lineless trappings are pretty attractive, but it still has a lot of spring in its step, like the previous one. It makes each environment they visit feel more tangible and such. Anything from a crab to a caiman wouldn't feel out of place. It's a pretty fun show, but not something many would be enthusiastic for in 2021, but it's definitely achieved its goals.
Hey everyone! Molly of Denali is made possible in part by...
In these days, when everybody is talking about doing his thing, here's the story of a boy who not only talks about it, but does it.
Laurentians, here we come.
Molly of Denali is only a bit over 2 years old, but it already has fetched decades worth of clout for its important work. I was already pretty familiar with this one, but I got a chance to really sit down and absorb the atmosphere a little more. I like how naturalistic it is. Sounds like a very obvious observation, but I'm talking more about the structure and the ethos of it as a show. To me, it's not that far removed from the early 90s Nick series or even some of the more grounded PBS series of the 2000s. Much of the other PBS cartoons are concerned with tying in fantastical ideas with concepts that kids can sink their teeth into to cement these concepts, while Molly takes a pretty passive but not negligent approach. It's clear the main crux of the show is about cultural diffusion and such, but the secondary focus is on informational data. Maps, calendars, GPS tracking, guidebooks, all of it helps cement the adventures presented. arguably filling gaps that might be left behind by school curriculum. Only other show that really took a swing at stuff like that may have been Fetch, but the show that came to mind while watching this was actually Sagwa, which you're free to interpret as you wish. I enjoyed my time with all three shows. Obviously, the show is most prolific for its approach to representation. It's not entirely made by indigenous folks, but it seems like the producers were careful to have as much involvement as possible. Much of the show is still written by a typical slate of Canadian and American children's writers, but the soul of the show was cemented with the help of many advisors, a primarily indigenous cast, and a particular attention to detail regarding this universe. Considering that the whole thing is focused on visibility, mainly framed through Molly's pursuits of logging her life, they've done a decent job of getting their point across. As you may already know, the show did fetch itself, among other things, a Peabody Award. It's a distinction granted to film and television that is considered to have made important waves in the zeitgeist. Molly was awarded alongside the Owl House in the same year, so hopefully that may motivate you to look at it a bit differently. The show's a pretty chill vibe. I'd throw it on for a good time and nothing too out there. It's a triple thread of good lessons, strong characters, and a solid mission in place for such a solid cartoon.
Funding for Hero Elementary has been provided by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education's Ready to Learn program.
Hero Elementary strikes me as a series that is perhaps too far past its time. Had it been a project from the late 90s or something, I imagine it'd be more lively and bouncy in execution than it is now. Visually, it's not the most imaginative. The art direction of the show gives it the feel of a YouTube short. Pretty simplistic, flatter backgrounds contrast against the thin-lined puppet-rig character models. The movement design is, of course, leagues above your average Coco Melon-featured finger family favoring YouTube channel, but I think the show lacks appeal, generally. The characters themselves are pretty typical. While at certain points they may seem as if they fit in different properties, they all fit well into the mold of the show. Apparently they dig into STEM concepts by blending superpowered antics with certain observational skills. There are plenty of episodes spent having to compare and contrast certain elements. Environmental sciences are also not neglected in this series, making it a bit more well-rounded than initially expected. The premise itself may be a bit hard to sink your teeth into. The superhero angle is just a hook to get you into problem solving and the like. I'd venture to guess that for a few reasons, some kind of out of the show's control, it's not a current favorite. It's pretty green, so there's still some time for it to switch focus, but generally, there's a solid slate of science-based properties that could take its place and do its mission better. For a project helmed by a couple of Sesame Street alum, it's a bit underwhelming, but there's nothing in it I could imagine steering kids away from it point blank. That said, there's one attribute of the show that makes it quite admirable in my eyes, and that would be its autism representation. See, typically in these situations, the autistic character involved is a one-off that came out of nowhere, or perhaps a friend or a family member vaguely connected to one that we're familiar with. Here, one of our main four protagonists, AJ Gadgets, is coming with a different energy. He's a forward-thinking, active member of the crew whose technological prowess could easily trump his teammates' power set with one invention. He's in the center of the action, but they subtly incorporate stims and sensitivities and little foibles into the stories. They didn't even really address his diagnosis head-on until what's supposed to be the tail end of the season. I don't think they did anything revolutionary when explaining it, but they notably took a more proactive approach when talking about how autism affects AJ in particular. It's really refreshing to see a character that represents this chunk of the spectrum. I've always found it wild that these shows overemphasize how autism affects everyone differently, yet each character they create to represent it is largely the same character with the same sensitivities in the same situations. There's no one of these characters that's a perfect fit necessarily. There's no one-size-fits-all character for it, which is why it's good to see something different that's explicit and not just unintentionally coded. It's wild that this small project is running circles around much bigger influences for doing something different. Otherwise, it's your silver standard as far as PBS cartoons go.
Major funding for Cyber Chase is provided by
Oh, man. Oh, God. Oh, man. Oh, God. Oh, man. Oh, God. Oh, man.
The concept of cyber chase in current year really bums me out. This isn't to ignore its incredible legacy or its comparable accomplishments over the years in math education. In fact, I'd say it's more in the absence of those traits that causes such immense despair within my fragile being. I think we all remember the original Cyber Chase episodes, which became quite popular for managing to mix these 3 kids into a cyber terrorism storyline and gradually unravel mysteries by uncovering different units of math. It was a high-stakes venture for its time. If there was an extra hair out of place, the whole concept would have fallen flat on its face in seconds. It came along at the right time with the right people at its side, and its enduring success really did expose how much good it did. We can surmise over the years that public television in the US has been under attack for a while. If not directly threatened for the sake of culture war musings, then the minimal financial investments made to keep it running usually take a hit out of alleged frugality. There are quite a few notable PBS series, and even a few in their kids' fare, that have had an extended lifespan, seeing its commissioners and financiers resist the allure of tackling newer ideas that may be easier to manage. It's not super common, but it's not unheard of to have certain series continue for a decade or two while still pursuing what made them so valuable. This relates to Cyber Chase in that the show literally stops being about math. Well, not all at once. It was a pretty slow process. Season 6 marks the first time that the series had been flash animated. It was only 2007, but it was a methodical move to help keep costs down. Subsequently, the topics of the season were split between what's classified as builder's math and math in sports, which, to its credit, is not yet too far removed from the original curriculum. Season 7 gets to explore math and weather in a slightly shorter season. An even shorter 8th season does a mix of old and new concepts from the previous 7. And then season 9 up to the 12th and presumably final season, they focus mainly on conservation, environmental awareness, and health wellness. Instead of stopping a fascist dictator from taking over a virtual realm for power and conquest, these 3 kids now are federally mandated to freak out every time a little bit of extra water is wasted.
Yikes! That's a lot of glasses of water. Imagine how many you'd have in a full day.
See what I mean?
Now I need you to understand, this is a pretty wild sight to see. Instead of helping kids navigate the most contentious school subject in the history of history, we're treading over the same commentary every other show has espoused 10 or 20 years earlier. I probably wouldn't mind so much, but the tone of the show clearly switched. It's so vapid to earnestly see everyone lose it over comparatively minor issues, at least in the context of cyberspace. They could have even taken a more radical approach and taken aim at the real perpetrators of climate change and environmental disrepair, or even the ineffectual leaders that flippantly enable it. But they choose to regurgitate the same few talking points to reinforce its stale mission. Watching some of those middle episodes back, you could tell math was still a significant part of the story, whether it's about analyzing data or simply just representation. The ecologically inclined seasons managed to throw such a delicate balance out the window so fast. What's more, the frequency of which they favored in scheduling is really skewed. There are definitely long runners that can shuffle up their episode count, like Curious George and Arthur, but choices made for Cyber Chase came at the behest of the literal selling point of the show. The Flash seasons take up around 40% of the show, but they make up arguably 80 or 90% of the reruns. There are definitely some younger shows that could help fill the void, like Peg plus Cat, and another show we'll touch on a bit later, but generally it's still disconcerting to see it play alongside the current crop of shows in its extremely neutered state of existence. It's still the most popular show in its niche, and it's a shame that it strayed so far away from such a rough topic. People still ask for more advanced episodes to be produced to this very day. At this point, I'm sure there's a lot of extra behind-the-scenes context we don't have, but on the surface level, it sucks that such an important resource got Thanos snapped so quickly.
Pinkalicious and Peterific is made possible in part by...
Na 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 na
Da-da-da. Pinkalicious and Peterific is secretly one of PBS Kids' top tier entries at the moment. And I know you don't believe me when I say that, and we're gonna talk about why that is. Honestly, it's a bitch slap to anyone's expectations, but its appeal is dangerously real. What essentially functions as the proletariat's Fancy Nancy is up there with the ancient greats. It truly is a time to be alive. This is a cursed reality we live in, but this is the truth. The simple, hard and fast truth. This is a very late adaptation of the eponymous books named after the former of the duo. Pinkalicious and Fancy Nancy are both Zoomer shit. It's a far cry from classic literature or anything. It's not even on par with, like, Horrid Henry. Both books feature excitable, stuck-up little girls completely absorbed in their glittery fantasies of having tea parties or bossing people around. If more boomers were familiar with it, they'd probably stop shitting on millennials long enough to lampoon the concept. Your mileage would vary with the material itself, but of course these are desirable protagonists due to their escapist escapades. The former was the first to get a show, but the latter was set to overshadow it a mere few months later, backed by Disney with many creatives behind it. Many would say it's a pretty close deposition from the books, much to anyone's chagrin, really. In a lot of ways, she's not too different from the target audience, but the fancy factor brought in with this character tends to be a bit overbearing. It doesn't take long for people to notice.
I just don't like her. Every show, she's like being a douche and self-involved and like totally shallow. There's like no growth whatsoever in this person. You know what I mean?
Not even Broadway tier songwriters can detract from how detestable the main protagonist may be. Pinkalicious actually does its job as an adaptation and switches things up. There's still a tangible connection to the books of lore without having the book steamroll any possibilities for growth. As far as I remember, I read both of these like eons ago, and like anyone else, I have no recollection of anything beyond the main cover. Though the one trait between these two franchises is that the title characters are pretty close to each other in scope and viewpoint. It's crazy to say, but the cartoon found a way to masterfully maintain that high-strung, over-invested spirit without maintaining much residual dickishness. Definitely has moments where she gets too hasty or acts irrationally, but Pinkalicious genuinely has the best interest of her friends and family in mind, and typically doesn't stray away from that. The mood of the show is definitely leaning towards saccharine, but it's more optimistic than unquestioningly sunshiny. Nancy goes out of her way to impose fancy, as if it was a non-negotiable way of life. Everyone's gotta learn about it, cause she's the expert. Pinkalicious, on the other hand, is more espousing experimental philosophy. The theme song gets to play with the idea of what the color pink really means to her, and it's a good peek behind the curtain as to what this series is like tonally.
Pink is imagining what we can be. A dancer, a robot, pirate at sea. Pink is a giggle that wiggles your toes. Pink is a sparkle that glows and glows.
These two characters have deceptively similar aesthetics, but the ideologies they preach are miles apart. Fancy Nancy sings about herself and how fanciness fulfills her personally, while Pinkalicious and everyone else around her get to sing about what pink means in a worldly context. Their philosophies and priorities are not as similar as their color palettes, and that's mainly what makes this so fascinating. Nancy is generally a more rigid and static character, fixates on herself and her own pursuits, while Pinkalicious, I don't know if she has a real name outside of that, but is a more flexible and complex figure, and she's concerned with the world around her and adapts to different styles and settings. A Pinkalicious for the people has never been so accessible. You probably noticed that extra character tacked onto the title, and you wonder, wait, was he part of the books too? Well, yes. Yes, he was, albeit arguably less of a central role. I'd be hard-pressed to label Peterific as a sidekick in the show proper, but in the books I'd venture to say he's not far off as a Rowley to his sister's Greg. So that's a terrible sentence. He probably took the boatload more shit in the books too. And even when he doesn't have to withstand such a polarizing character, he's still a bit of a foil for her. He's a bit more relaxed than his sister, but they're still bright-eyed and rearing to go at a moment's notice. He doesn't poo-poo his sister's interests, even if he likely doesn't share the same worship of Pink. And the reverse would apply to Pinkalicious as well. They have a mutual respect for each other, and all things considered, they seem to have each other's back. They're still younger kids, so they can be a bit babyish, but they're so good to each other, even on their worst days. The Pinkalicious cartoon has more surrealist tendencies than you'd ever expect. Snatched from the books, the weird hellhole that is Pinkville, yes, that is literally where they live, hosts a lot of self-indulgent phenomena, from bubblegum hamster wheel type escapees to fairies and gnomes and all this other shit. Some episodes are as normal as can be. Others are about the whole town knitting with the excess yarn that this random truck keeps dropping off in the middle of the park. It's all so random, but you don't really lose track of where everything is. Somehow, a lot of this bullshit makes sense, and each episode runs into the next seamlessly. To that end, the animation is deceptively simple, but it has great timing behind it. It took me a minute to realize how crisp it actually is, though the intro is likely the best gauge of its true power level. As with most adaptations, it follows in step with the book's art style faithfully, even down to the collage effect in the background and on certain props. It's an attention to detail you have to squint to appreciate, but no doubt speaks to how well they fleshed out this world. Half the cast is a bunch of kids that tend to give a good performance. I can't say I have complaints, though I'm sure the voice work of either title character would grate on you a bit, even if you're surprisingly tolerant. Undoubtedly, they were picked partially for their singing ability, and they gave them a shit ton of song work, which is generally pretty solid. Even if its cast isn't filled with Broadway performers and everything, there's clear enthusiasm and energy in the parts dished out, even amongst more low-key characters. Now you could probably interject and say, but wait, this is a PBS cartoon. What the hell does this teach? Well, ostensibly nothing. At least to me it doesn't. If you consult the educational materials that accompany it, you will find that its official designation is, well, hold on, let me refresh my memory. Let me look at this. Right. The arts? Come on, man. The arts, huh? The arts. The art. Obviously, you could point to those pro-social elements and say it teaches kids to be kinder or something, but they actually went with the arts. They have these interstitial segments where they visit a different type of artist. Some of them are singers, or painters, or cartoonists, or pumpkin carvers. That one was pretty cool. Otherwise, Pinkalicious wouldn't stand out amidst a backdrop of other series. Now, I'm giving this guff not because I believe that the arts are not worth teaching. In the grand scheme of things, it's probably a good subject matter to tackle in a PBS cartoon, because budgets for arts programs in schools always get cut first. But the execution of such in this show is so nebulous. It's such a tenuous grasp and connection to try to make. If this aired on Nick Jr., I wouldn't blink twice, and I think this is the only real flaw with the show. Like, it doesn't teach anything. The show turned out great, don't get me wrong, but I'd hope that PBS doesn't lean into projects like these without a stronger foundation for whatever they're saying that they want to teach, especially considering the severe imbalance in what their shows tend to do. Pinkalicious could have been a 12 out of 10 if they really went hard into the paint on some subject, whether it be the arts or a more clinical subject. Finding this hidden gem was a fascinating experience. I'm sure I didn't pitch it well enough, but you have plenty of time to go out and seek it if you truly want to look into it. If you were under the influence on an unnamed substance that I will not fill in the blank, it would undoubtedly be the litness. I can't even begin to describe it. There will never be another show as positively Pinkalicious as this one, and that's actually the saddest thing of this whole affair. If Bill Burr ever scopes this one out, it's getting his stamp of approval same day. I guarantee it.
Funding for Arthur is provided by...
So this entry follows much in the vein of Sesame Street and Cyber Chase, except it's exceedingly less negative. Based on how I treated the other two, probably would be breaking out the pitchforks and the torches at this point, and I'm glad to say it's not necessary this time. You have a little pitchfork break. We are rapidly approaching the point of no return as its final episode is eventually put on the schedule. In contrast to the other two, I didn't always appreciate Arthur for who he was or what his show was about. When I was his age, I just thought the show was consistently talking down to me, whilst quietly enjoying classics like The Great McGrady and April 9th. I could never take up the mantle of Arthur historian unironically, but as with most things, I really felt privileged to be able to see it shine. Unlike the two other long runners, it never really strayed away from its original purpose or stylings. Yeah, those Flash animated seasons are definitely harder to look at, and the stinkers they produced in that era are harder to ignore, what can I say? That being said, they gave us way too many good memories to ignore. Like the saga of the Everlasting Snowball, and the Library Musical, and the South Park parody, and the Backstreet Boys cameo, and even Anteater John Lewis. Who could forget about Arthur Great Anteater John Lewis? By the way, those recent web shorts slapped, in case you needed any reminder from me in particular. It's so crazy seeing the zeitgeist react to them in real time. It was a great note to leave on because it did remind me how hard in the paint Arthur always went, no matter the circumstances. It's been a glorious ride, and for better or for worse, the creative team behind it gave us the greatest opportunity to have a wonderful kind of day, any day, every day that we could imagine. And that's true power.
Funding for Don Quixote has been provided in part by...
Once upon a time, the most famous knight errant, the one and only.
I am Don Quixote.
Of course you are. They all are.
Don Quixote is ultimately a very interesting spec script. This reinterpretation of wild proportions is next in the direct Fred Rogers line of succession. Similar to Daniel Tiger, Don Quixote decided to age up the title character and give him a younger family member to teach lessons. The original Don Quixote was a realistic-looking latex donkey head on Fred's hand. The one in this show is his granddaughter, who has new and exciting adventures with a bunch of assorted characters from the Rogerverse, usually aged down to her level. Most of these guys were grown folks in costumes before they were plushified in these reinterpretations. The show follows in step with Daniel Tiger within the context of the social and emotional development it cribs. Though in being for slightly older kids, it tackles more general problem solving and social skills than emotional management. It's one of those shows where the setup plays second fiddle to the character interaction. I like how detailed the background design is. Modern puppet shows seem like they carry a hefty price tag compared to the average TV cartoon, but they didn't skimp out here. By design, they kept a lot of the old school neighborhood callbacks in and generally set some good touches up for keen eyes. They tend to do more with the puppets than we're used to seeing. A lot of hand models were built with feet and legs they almost never use. Even with modern technology, the work required to set up the illusion of full body motion with hand puppets is a big opportunity cost. Yet they employ it quite frequently to help set up the atmosphere. The music is pretty interesting. Like New Clifford, they tend to dip into different styles and melodies. I distinctly remember hearing a song that, to me, wouldn't seem all that out of place in something like Bear in the Big Blue House. It was a nice discovery. The characters themselves feel a little interchangeable, which is understandable considering the premise. Don Quixote is your typical go-getter that perseveres to the nth degree. I like that she doesn't just solve other people's problems, but processes many of them too. The tone of the show puts me out of sorts. It has an energetic, quirky zeal that much of the Rudman brother works do, but it's a bit gentler in approach as well. It's an interesting setup. From my initial assessment, I found myself hesitant to list the skim positives I could identify. I watched a couple more episodes right before I got to this section, and they definitely heightened my praise for it. There's a possibility it might make for a good program for older Daniel Tiger fans to graduate to, despite being of a very different tone. It might keep some parents from clawing their ears out or writing any more angry Medium articles. Otherwise, I don't really see a chance for a periphery demographic to wedge their way into viewing this, which is totally fine. If that's Don Quixote's biggest problem, she's clearly in good hooves.
This episode was made possible by the following.
È lui l'agente oso, missioni ne farà. Speciale strepitoso, qualcuno aiuterà.
Odd Squad actually took a while for me to check out. At least where I am, it's been shunted off to a primetime slot when the target audience would be eating dinner or something. That's usually where I was when it came on. This is also where older stuff like Wild Kratts and Arthur typically live, though through special programming you may end up seeing them throughout the day anyway. I only made a concerted effort to catch it once I knew I'd be doing this project. Once I actually got to see it for myself, it's pretty much everything I expected it to be. An anticlimactic discovery, but not an unwelcome one. Odd Squad typically gets a lot of attention for the writing and how it enhances the premise of these secret agent kids running around Toronto charting weird phenomena. It's a Nick sitcom, but with some weight to it. In theory, it's more simplistic than something like Henry Danger, but it takes itself more seriously. You've got an entire ensemble of kids standing in for this giant organization, but you only really get a full view of maybe half a dozen while they do their thing. In general, it's pretty solid. I think it met my expectations at eye level, and it didn't break from that. It's like a college humor sketch extended out and perpetually kept in character. I imagine it being a bit more low-key, and the character acting and tone does help it attract a bit of a periphery demographic. It didn't really stick for me until they threw us into a Hunger Games-style tournament arc. I could see the draw to it in that moment. I was thoroughly invested in the politics of it. I'm not that far in, but it seemed like there's plenty of continuity at play. I'm doubting this would happen, but if there was a mechanism where the main agents would age up more considerably, they probably could work their way up to more complex math concepts too. Oh yeah, this show teaches math, apparently. Grade school math specifically seems to be connected to the oddities that the Odd Squad encounter, though to be honest, it seems to take a backseat to the stories they're trying to tell. This is an interesting show, an experiment I reckon that they wouldn't be likely to replicate. So keep track of this one. It's seemingly already quite popular, but you may want to gear up to petition for a well-timed spin-off or something. It's a good egg to have around.
Funding for Alma's Way has been provided in part by...
And now it's all meta and forwards is backwards. Skateboard kids used to dress like rappers, but now you got rappers dressing like skaters. Multiple layers of cultural appropriators. Cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation.
Alma's Way gets me hyped in ways that I can't even describe. It seems like it was a pet project for PBS, but if it wasn't a damn good one. Early into my rendezvous, I got to see this one premiere and flesh its world out wholesale. Its focus is really simplistic, but it's not one that would typically be given credence. It's as straightforward as that synopsis, but personally it means a lot more than is being said. PBS came directly to Sonia Manzano to request a pitch for a new show. She did well to draw from her own experiences and create a character that was definitely her, but also an independent spirit. The show turns a normal neighborhood walk into an avenue to make kids more perceptive and in tune with the world around them. I'm trying to find ways to string this out, but the fact is that it's just a really fun and meaningful show. The diversity is literally the biggest strength. Similar to Molly and Denali, but with a trend towards critical thinking skills. It's just a really, really refreshing product. There's not many ways I could say that. One of the dominant problems with modern entertainment is that the industry finds itself chasing its own tail, constantly trying to catch up with itself. They can espouse as many progressive or forward-thinking ideas as they want, but they usually end up utilizing and benefiting adequately from the old systems at play that they speak against. Preschool content, especially in animation, is typically given a lot of time and attention, but even they have deficiencies. The last show in this lineup, literally the next one, features 2 out of 3 non-white main characters, but simultaneously, all 3 are voiced by white kids. This isn't too much of a concern for me personally, trust me, I don't care, but I know a lot of people would take umbrage with such a concept, especially when even the likes of Paw Patrol can be better attuned to that shit. There are contradictory forces at play, which is part of why a lot of diversity initiatives and PR campaigns feel more hollow than broken bird bones. PBS in particular has an interesting relationship to this dissonance. They have a long, storied history of reaching marginalized audiences through their work. Sesame Street, Cyber Chase, Word Girl, even the Fred Rogers line have been known for reaching some vulnerable populations by pouring their all into it and succeeding. They're self-aware of this legacy, and they don't exactly crib listlessly off it, but most of their series can only really do half the work. Most of these diverse series and concepts don't have as many diverse folks behind the wheel in a creative sense. It's exceedingly rare that a show addressing certain cultures is created by someone of said culture in this industry. I bet you, even in current year, most people don't know that Doc McStuffins was created by a white woman. Nobody knows that. It's like ancient history. So you have to appreciate that a show created by a Latina utilized local Bronxite talent, the music is straight out of the borough, and it generally did everything in its power to represent this place as best it could. And it's absolutely smashing. As someone who's familiar with the area, I can tell you that it is a beautiful tribute. And then, to carry on the absurdity of this slam dunk, wait for this, wait. They greenlit a whole other short series to talk about Filipino culture, and then they slapped it on the end of every episode to air back to back. It's pure keto, I'm telling you. It's amazing. See, this is the type of energy that we should be leading with. Far be it for a prick like me to inform direction for thousands of people, but if we continue to lead with projects like these, we'd be on a much better track. This is the type of project that gets me genuinely hyped and invested, knowing in earnest that there are many more kids that undoubtedly get to see themselves in it. It's great, but beyond that, the concept is just a good send-up. I have nothing but love for it, in all honesty. It's perfect. Perfect in my eyes. 10 out of 10. Now this is by far the most interesting property on this list. Unintentionally, we have saved the best for last here. I'm happy to go into deeper detail on this one since it really is the last one, but be forewarned that comparatively, it's a bit long in the teeth. Though not necessarily my favorite of this new batch, it's the one that will probably have me coming back to revisit it from time to time, and it had enough roughage to likely sustain a small review in its own right. In simpler terms, strap in. It's a bit of a long one.
Whoa! Welcome to the show!
The concept of Xavier Riddle is a completely original idea stemmed from the success of this biographical book series for kids. The author and illustrator had a tight lock on the feeling these are supposed to invoke, and when asked to convert the books into an animated spectacle, they gave this rogues gallery of historical figures a singular point of reference that connects them all. A group of 3 kids that consult a historical hideout to visit each person and learn little life lessons along the way. The trio heard described as follows. The inspiration for Xavier came from my own house. My youngest son is a dreamer, so enthusiastic, but he can't tie his own shoes. Yedida will grow up to be the president. Brad is anxious about everything. He has delusions of averageness. Keep this guy in the back pocket. We're gonna come back to him in a bit. The genesis behind its adaptation is pretty interesting. This was essentially a whole new concept, definitely melded with the series that wouldn't normally be palatable to this type of format. The justification is similar to every other answer typically given, but the execution is pretty top-notch. Like the amount of detail thrown into these transitional characters just so we can learn a couple things about Abraham Lincoln was pretty incredible. For one, I have to tip my hat to the aesthetics. It's definitely one of the more cinematic TV cartoons I've seen in a while. It's a bit hard to pinpoint. While there is a sophistication to its trappings, it still keeps the ethos from getting too melodramatic. Peep that opening track, it'll start to click after a listen or two. The orchestration in general is pretty cool. In shorthand, I think of it like Night at the Museum Light. They tend to give everything a grand scale, even when the goofiest shit is happening. The art direction easily makes it one of the most complex of this whole lineup. The amount of ground they cover in about 35 half hours takes us to some of the most interestingly ornate scenic designs this side of animation can offer. Keeping in mind, too, that they would typically never reuse the same historical backdrop twice, and you have to take a beat to admire it. The main character design is cribbed from the books, being described as a loving mashup of Charles Schultz and Bill Watterson. It was smoothed out and streamlined pretty well for the animation pipeline. You're gonna love the subtle line boil they attach at certain points. All the kid characters are outfitted with these giant bobbleheads, but nobody feels particularly out of place. Believe it or not, you can get a lot more subtle character acting done here, even with those beady little dot eyes.
Call me the plant doctor because I'm always helping plants. It's important to take care of the earth.
I don't know if I'd say Xavier Riddle is a sharp show with uber super clever writing, but I think it does have a specific edge to it. The main trio is at least a bit self-aware, and the main framing device has them open and close every episode as a separate performance. The premise of the series itself is played off well enough, but the characters are their own comedy of errors. There's such a smooth delivery of all the banter and the extra bits that makes each of them stand out. As smart and morally just as they may be, they're still at times impulsive, a bit unfocused, and just not open to certain things. The main trio are a lot like regular kids, and favorably are far from interchangeable. I did want to focus on someone specific though, more notably, a character that would be content out of the spotlight. But his involvement in the show is emblematic of the type of progress that the show tries to make with the kids at home.
Oof! That's gonna hurt.
Brad is one of the most inverted self-inserts I have ever seen. He's essentially the author of the original books shadowing the escapades of his creation. He gets to travel back in time every day, and he still finds time to roast himself. Honestly, I think Brad's the most integral character of this outfit. He's sure not the title character, but the way he moves throughout the show provides a great arc for the audience to follow. If you're above the age of 7, you are likely watching this show from his perspective. He's not exactly the straight man, but you'd likely have more in common with his way of thinking. Everybody knows a Brad. I'm sure some of you watching right now may be that Brad. It's not a super uncommon position to be in. A little neurotic, slightly risk-averse, silently determined person that's still a bit lost in the weeds and trying to find themselves. When I first heard of him, he seemed to be like a transparent Charlie Brown XB. It's not nearly as depressing, but he is definitely a bit down on himself. The kid that plays him is also kind of typecast as this happy-go-lucky ball of sunshine, so the juxtaposition in my head was a lot more dramatic. Cody from Total Dramarama is one thing.
Can we get more rice pudding? I love hospital food.
The Bat Kid from a few shows back is another.
Did you see that? She rolled it back. Yep. My little sister is great at learning things.
And Brad is just Brad. Reliably so.
To the secret museum!
Allergies and time travel? This is not my day.
Despite his close kinship with the Riddle kids, he's not connected to the museum formally, but is arguably the person that leans into it the most. Like, typically the Riddles get a lot of obvious advice for their predicaments, the merits of slowing down, learning to be an active listener, being careful with your words and everything. Almost all of Brad's solutions that are tailored for him culminate in life-affirming shit. He's being asked to stretch his legs and open his horizons. He's learning from the more practical teachings too, but the ones that are made for him are pretty aspirational. Being reminded to be open to new experiences and share more of yourself is the type of stuff that you likely would identify with more. His struggles are twofold. He's obviously going through kid stuff, but he's also going through these sets of experiences that have to reinforce Brad to be Brad. Like, there's nothing wrong with being a Brad. The show doesn't penalize him for being Brad. We just need to see him come into his own more. He's learning to be the Brad. Unabashedly and more enthusiastically Brad. When Brad gets the double whammy of lesson learning, the audience gets to take that end result away for themselves. whether it's a Brad or not. We are living vicariously through him. We are also being taught to give ourselves the same glow-up and attention in each major episode. And that can be a really gratifying trip to go on.
Ready to go back in time?
You mean back in time? Get it? Because his name's Bach? It's funny.
Philosophically, Xavier Riddle seems to follow a very idealistic tack. Clearly the show is trying to push the audience into doing their own research rather than giving the whole lecture. Its moral compass is simple, not terribly fleshed out. It's supposed to get kids thinking and motivated to do more. In any conversation about racial relations, they will always talk up the tenets of equality rather than equity. Mostly pure and blind acceptance of good over bad, rather than exploring what makes good and bad and the nuances of it. I think the approach can be a bit contentious, but the lean towards positive affirmation and reinforcing the values they teach are a major focal point. It lays it on quite thick, but the vibe of the show makes it a theatrical experience. The show and the people behind it seem to have a strong desire to present the target audience with real heroes. Anytime Brad Meltzer, that's the author dude, was pressed about the origins of the book series, he would usually refer back to his kids and his goal of diverting them from humanity's current social ills. This mission takes on another layer of dimensionality within the context of the last few years. History will have a time recapping the last half-decade. From what I could gather, the timeline of the show's development likely started either early into the previous presidency or within the final months of the 2016 election cycle. There's plenty of cartoons produced or greenlit during that era that are more invested in being kind and humanistic. Xavier Riddle carries some of that energy too, but it also carried a lot of concrete lessons to take away and knew how to cement them. While the main plot is busy inspiring its way into a lesson plan, it does grip you in different ways. By far, this is the most mysterious entry on this whole list. There's so many details sprinkled in and kept for continuity's sake. But the more you learn about the universe, the more questions you end up having. I've seen basically most of the current batch, and I still have so many thoughts. Like, where is the show set exactly? Where is the museum, and what's the origin story of the Riddle family museum? What makes this thing a secret? Is it an open secret? Is it a secret how it's still kept open? Is the government in on this? It's clearly a family institution, but they don't live here, do they? Wait, how do they live here? How come these school-aged children are almost never seen inside a school? Why are the historical figures they meet still children with full beards? How does Brad get to stay over day in and day out? Where are his parents? Where are the parents? How did he become part of the museum-keeping team? He clearly wasn't there his whole life. Why does everyone in this godforsaken dimensional paradox run like Charlie Brown? It's hilarious, but it's distracting. Even certain details dropped during their movie. They had a movie. Don't really demystify anything. They squeezed like 5 episodes in one, and they only answered like 2 questions. Biggest ripoff of the decade. It should be noted that the series structure can be a bit counterintuitive in certain angles. Obviously, the lessons it espouses are mainly meant to inspire the audience to go through these experiences with gusto. It can't give the full lecture, but the SparkNotes version is just enough to get the point across. The historical aspects are likely already considered a secondary focus, but in certain episodes it becomes pretty obvious when the course of the plot can become limiting. Like each moral they run through applies to each figure, but some certainly fit better than others. Sometimes the specific focus can easily gloss over other important traits. I also noticed that while each moral of the episode is not really out of place for each hero, the scenarios and events they show to get the point across sometimes clash spectacularly. Sometimes people do point out the narrow focus that these have, but it's usually aimed at like the minor factoids and things. There are whole episodes that talk about why someone's important and not like explicitly talk about what they did outside of the framing. There's a wild episode they did on Jonas Salk, the guy who created the polio vaccine. They highlighted him and show off how good it is to do good without expecting anything in return, how helping people, even without being rewarded, can easily be its own prize. And the catalyst that sent the three of them to him was that they shoveled the museum steps and they didn't get any hot cocoa in return.
No hot chocolate at all?
And after all that hard work.
You know, I think these vague connections work better for more prolific figures like Einstein or Earhart. You know, these are people that kids already can identify. The more obscure people they highlight aren't always done in a roundabout way, but certain episodes are positively confusing in approach. Moreover, a lot of the episodes featuring black historical figures are pretty hit or miss, not only because their episodes may swerve a lot of their important accomplishments, but the nature of the featured events themselves. They will showcase everything about Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, up to the part where they threw her off the bus. Or maybe they'll sideline the various advocacy done by George Washington Carver just to talk about his secret garden and taking care of plants. They didn't even talk about the peanut products. How do you swerve all those peanut products? It's been said that the Jackie Robinson episode was received poorly enough that it may have been shelved from American broadcast, but don't quote me on that. A contentious point of the episode reinforcing that Jackie did invite a prejudiced little white girl over to his house for a snack, even after she kicked him off of her lawn.
You have to treat everyone fairly, no matter what. If you do, they just might come around and treat you fairly too.
Now, philosophically, the main motivator behind the show may pale in comparison to what's being talked about. It's difficult to really delve into the equality we're supposed to have between us if we can't dig deeper into the inequitable bits too. The gang's reactions to slavery, the subsequent descriptions are a bit on the nose.
And I thought being treated differently because of my coat was bad. Being treated differently because of your skin is terrible. And really wrong.
I imagine that the target age range for the show may have held them back in some regard, but scenes like this may ring hollow without the proper context involved. I'm moreover a bit surprised they didn't leverage the main characters to speak deeper about racial inequity. 2 of the 3 main characters are brown. You'd think they'd have a bit more to say in this area, even if they're speaking from a presumed point of privilege or ignorance. It would have been cool to perhaps see them think through the implications of racism.
Hey, why isn't everyone cheering?
Like, instead of letting Jackie Robinson just carry on unopposed during that one game, they could have been having a conversation amongst themselves, likely running through some other reactions the audience might have, like anger or fear. It is racism, after all. You can kind of do that. You have some flexibility there. All that being said, I wouldn't call this a bad approach per se. It's a pretty complicated tack to try and break this down for a kindergartner to be able to understand. There are likely many cringy drafts of those slavery sequences hidden away somewhere, but at the end of the day, the show's delicate approach to these issues is definitely more helpful than it could have been.
That bust would make an awesome museum exhibit. Oh, right. It already is. Burby, let's go home.
Xavier Riddle was funded for 37 half hours, along with an hour-long special marketed as that film. As I write this, PBS seems to have released all but 3 episodes, one of which is a half-hour season finale centered around Fred Rogers. Apparently these 3 have aired up north in Canada and in Europe somewhere, but not on American television. As I was wrapping up the script for this video, it was revealed that they would be airing these last 3 episodes pretty soon. But it is pretty unclear whether the project will be revisited for new content. It's been a bit over 2 years, and there are no hints or indications that it would be recommissioned. It seems like shows from this modern era are greenlit in a bigger than usual batch, and they get split up into seasons if it's popular, which is not exactly new strategy in the industry. I don't think they really even have hiatuses. I've been told that this show has been on hiatus for a while, but I don't know if that could even really apply. I mean, Steven Universe is one thing, and this is a whole other thing. So I don't know if they have hiatuses, but when it's all said and done, that's seemingly the end of it. There's a few other shows that been on the lookout for a while, like Pinkalicious and Molly and Eleanor especially. But allegedly, they might not be going anywhere. I'm not quite sure how a renewal would work out. PBS politics are a bit complicated, and I'm sure the pandemic has not helped in this regard. I think the reason why Xavier Riddle resonated with me so heavily was that it seemed to exemplify the point of its broadcaster so thoroughly. Through a combination of its philosophy and teaching style, it crafted a formula to captivate its base against a backdrop of total pandemonium going on in the real world. There's plenty of shows in this lineup that are popular or perhaps well-renowned and respected, but those chumps are, again, victims of their own success. They can keep up with the curriculum, but the data and the sponsors start to drive the motivation and the stories after a while. Xavier doesn't have the benefit of years of experience with trial and error. The source material isn't even a decade old yet, apparently. At times it does share a couple of flaws with the main character, but its energy and aptitude to inspire kids is what stands out. It has the same zeal as the shows and figures that inspired Meltzer and the crew. Half a century from now, there will likely be powerful people in every sector that can harken back to this show the same way that we harken back to Clifford and Cyberchase. Kids like them will surely change the world, and Xavier Riddle will have deftly led them down that path.
It's time for the moment you've been waiting for.
Alright, enough playing around. You've survived long enough. It is finally time to tackle the rankings. Now, as you could probably guess, this scaling that I've applied specifically only applies to this current set of shows. I tried to stick to whatever criteria I'd use for the original tier list. God tier are excellent shows that are top of their niche. Top tier is for everything that didn't make it into God tier but is still pretty good. Mid tier is pretty self-explanatory. There are certain series that got bumped down just based on my assessment of their strengths and weaknesses. Xavier and Daniel Tiger are probably worthy of higher praise, but their flaws are really transparent in the face of more deserving candidates. I don't truly feel like any of these are low tier, at least not in this batch. The fell-off tier is specifically for those golden oldies that have recent issues but are generally known for being great. Now, accounting for the rest of the shows in the old list, the bell curve of the scoring could change dramatically. Plenty of the old shows would remain in theory, but one would have to be aggressive as to what stays and what goes. So this was my swing at it. The basic configuration stayed the same. I only added two other tiers that could easily sum up my thoughts on the leftovers that didn't neatly fit into the other tiers. Deserve More is self-explanatory. Again, they're likely shows that were edged at a top tier that it was not comfortable outright saying they were mid, because they're not. Maybe they have some achievements or longevity to them that didn't accurately compete with those higher tiered shows. Maybe they're just that entertaining. I don't know. Sagwa tier is specifically for that group of shows that I can't seriously grade for fear of waking a sleeping giant. Comparatively scoring them would open rifts in time-space that I'm not prepared to close by myself. So let's just say that they're all good shows and they live their best life, okay? In contrast, the fell-off tier is more or less the same. Caillou would have made it in easily, but you can't exactly fall from a height you've never reached. Certain shows got bumped up or down since this version was tied to a longevity and impact a little bit more. Every subject got a representative, more or less. There's a bit of a split since there's several types of science that got covered. There's a couple of shows I had to put in mid-tier that by and large I could still enjoy today. Trying to manage a list like this objectively is difficult in such a format. In fact, I found it a bit easier to organize them in a more recent format, a regular tier list. So that's exactly what I did next. Though it was a little easier to bump some things up, the spread is largely the same as it was before. Sagwa tier and the genuine Hall of Famers share space at the top of the chart, and whatever trickled down is more or less the same. B tier pretty much just became the deserve better category. Had to put some entertaining shit down lower, but hey, at least there's no F tier, right? By and large, this work is obviously never done. There are plenty of new and old properties that didn't even make the original tier list, and that's okay. I think the rankings here gave a bit more nuance and catharsis to the original. And one day, I know we as a species will regroup as people and come back to the table to organize the full, unadulterated tier list. Despite my varied analyses of these shows, I was fascinated to revisit such an interesting place for cartoons. PBS seems like one of the few destinations in modern entertainment that can actually thrive on completely new and original content. The last decade has given us an interesting mix of concepts, whether they were dredged from the deep trenches of marketable nostalgia, or if they were freshly snatched from the secret garden of totally green ideas. The big three, and whosoever chose to join that rat race, are constantly screeching and scraping through barrel bottoms to get a chance to remonopolize on all those old properties and franchises. In their interpretation, their collective lifeblood is dependent on the flow of reboots that they produce. Meanwhile, it seems like most shows on PBS Kids aren't allowed to go on for too long, unofficially or otherwise. Aside from a few legacy holdovers, they're constantly experimenting and working to fill the schedule. It comes to the point where by the time you figure out that some of them exist, they're either altered beyond comprehension or they're definitely on their way out. Anytime we talk about mainstream cartoons here, it becomes second nature to embed these videos with some sort of call to action. Even if it doesn't need our support, it just feels right to say, hey, Big City Greens needs another season, and we can all influence that, right? Right? As much as I'm super compelled to say that right now, half of these new shows were already on the chopping block before they were out, presumably. Don't quote me on that. There's a lot of voices out there trying to determine what kids especially should watch. In many ways, the freedom of choice is a great resource, but in others, the wide variety is often saturated and pervasive. There's dueling lines of thought in animation for general audiences at play, let alone the content your 5-year-old is supposed to consume. The decision to run with the repackaged content has several obvious perks, but it seems like this brand has the negative consequences of the strategy fully realized. Arguably, the brand literally cannot survive without some innovation in their corner. Every year, their colleagues in this space continue to section off older IP for the sake of the streaming wars. The fact that we've embraced the reality where regular kids have to wait almost a year for new Sesame Street episodes is wild enough. But the scraps thrown to PBS at times is just a whole other brand of crazy. They literally cannot compete with them. So while they're not directly running with the bulls, in some respects, they've managed to outpace them just running alongside. It's especially poignant now that the big three all have preschool content to showcase, of which the biggest of each are probably running counter to PBS's whole mission one way or another. Here we've managed to have the full spread of subjects, topics, and approaches. Aside from some outliers, these are mostly new ideas that came from all types of folks who had similar end goals. Instead of relying on reboots and rehashes, they were willing to experiment and invite different schools of thoughts to bring these shows to life. The few shows that go back to the drawing board often find solace in fresh starts and new beginnings. They run the gamut in giving the viewers the global experience, whether among friends new or old, in lands digital or organic, in past, present, or future. They all manage to get the job done, one way or another. PBS Kids' slate is probably one of the best arguments you can make for wholly original content in the 2020s. If you roll the dice and gamble on a really cool project, they often find their own audience quite naturally. If you do right by the audience, they will do right by you and will carry the show much farther than you could ever imagine. These shows stick with people, even amidst apocalyptic circumstances. They have a way of coming right back at us. All you gotta do is put your best foot forward. You never know. You might end up with your own cash cow someday.